Hey everyone, it's Chris Arndt, back with another tutorial. Today we are going to be going over the basics of color correction. Color correction's a big passion of mine with video editing, and so I'm happy to finally be kind of tackling that subject. The first thing I'm going to do is show you guys kind of how to open up your color correction tools on Adobe Premiere, or at least the basic ones. So the first thing I'm going to do is move my webcam capture over to the other side of the screen, because we're mostly going to be playing around in this far side where I currently have essential graphics. There are two things we need to open in order to get color correcting. The first is we're going to go into our window tab and click on lumetri color. That will open up on the far side of your screen. The second thing we're going to open is our lumetri scopes. So there's a few things to tackle real quick before we start to deal with the lumetri scopes, and that is making sure they are set to the right settings. So in order to adjust settings, we're going to go into this little wrench icon down here. We're going to click on that and make sure that these two are selected: Parade RGB and Waveform Luma. So again, that's Parade RGB and Waveform Luma. Each of these are the two different screens you see above. So this up here, the RGNB, is our Parade, and then Waveform here is our Luma. If they say something else, if it's Parade, another couple of letters, whatever, that's no problem. You just have to go into your settings down here for parade type. You want to make sure RGB is selected, and then going back, waveform type, Luma. It's as simple as that. So if what you're seeing doesn't look something like this, then try going into your settings and changing some things up. I'm going to talk about two main concepts in video editing, at least when it comes to color and color correction. Those two are our color temperature, or our white balance, and our exposure. So these two different screens tell us both of these things. Our Luma, our white waveform, tells us the exposure of our shot. So real quick, if I really bring up my exposure, you'll see that our entire shot is now all up in the 190 type setting for our lumetri scopes. If I bring it all the way down, same idea, everything is super low on that scale. You'll note that our red, green, and blue waveforms are also doing this. That's because ultimately white is made up, at least on TVs or screens, of red, green, and blue. So when our exposure is super low, our red, green, and blue are super low as well. So I'll double click on that to reset it. The other thing we can read here is our white balance. So in my shot that is particularly orange, we see that there's a lot of red, a fair bit of green, and not much blue. Simply speaking, there's a more complex way to read these scales, but that's the basics of it. So if I bring things way more orange, our red goes up. If I bring things very blue, our blue goes up. Our goal in getting a proper white balance is to balance these three different scales into something that looks like it's supposed to. We can do this in our cameras when we're filming, but if we don't, we can also adjust it here in post. It's always better to do it in the field. The same with setting our exposure, that way things aren't too bright or too dark. But we do have a fair bit of control in post. So let's get right to it. As far as color correction goes, we primarily need to adjust these two things. So the first thing we're going to adjust is our white balance. That's kind of the first step in any color correction. So there's a couple ways to do this. The first is we can click on this little eyedropper tool and then click somewhere that is white on our screen. I tend not to trust this. It tends to give really skewed results. Like that. I just randomly clicked, but still. I'm going to undo that. What I tend to do is I tend to look at the lumetri scopes. So I know that our blue is particularly low in this shot. So if I drag it down so that it's mostly even with our red, there we go. And now we'll also note that we can adjust our tint, this green or magenta. So if you look at our scopes, you'll notice that our green is peaking a bit higher than the other two. So I'm going to drag things a little bit more magenta. Nothing crazy, just enough to keep everything pretty even. And now if I go up here to where it says FX under our lumetri settings, I can turn my entire effects layer on and off to see the results. So if I turn it off, that's our original versus a quick little bit of color correction. This isn't perfect. We could definitely spend hours more cleaning this up, but if this is a quick little video you're cutting together, even this makes a world of difference. So now let's talk about exposure. Exposure is made up of primarily 4 settings, but more generally, there's 6 settings we get to play around with. Those are exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. The 4 main settings are highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Each is a different level, ultimately speaking, of this graph here. But we're going to adjust it with our sliders. So my highlights are my whitest whites. My whites are a step below that. My shadows are a step below that. And my blacks are the darkest parts of my video. So you'll see as I was dragging all of those, different things were happening. The other 2 settings that we have are our general exposure, which tends to be a good thing just to start off with. If our video is just a tad dark in general, we can increase our exposure by 0.3 stops. Always work in points. If I adjusted it by 3 stops in total, it'd be blown out. So 0.3, and that just brightened everything up a little bit. Our goal is to make this as visible as possible, but also keeping in mind our aesthetic, because we're not getting into advanced color correction. We're not getting into advanced curves adjustments or anything like that. If these are the only settings we have to play with, let's at least throw in a little bit of creative flair per se. So I brought up my exposure a bit, and now we have the choice of, do we want our video to be contrasty or not? A non-contrasting video is very easily seen on screen. Pretty much any screen can interpret this and make it look acceptable. Whereas adding contrast adds, well, not only contrast, but it adds depth. It makes our shot feel a bit more alive. But going too far with this on certain screens will blow it out. It'll make it look really muddy and gross. And imagine painting a painting, and once you're done, going over every edge with a real thick Sharpie marker. That's what can happen on the wrong kind of TV screen. So I'm going to bring up our contrast a little bit, but nothing crazy. And if I turn that on and off, there's not a ton of difference. It's just enough to make a difference. You can start to see more depth come out in that door in the back, or in this spoon thing on the ceiling. So I'll go somewhere around 30 with that. Again, this is kind of a combination of a science and an art. So next things I'm going to adjust are my highlights. I can bring my highlights up a little bit. I know that because the top of my lumetri scopes isn't adjusted the wrong thing. When I adjust it, I can bring them up, and since they're not peaking anywhere near 100, I can bring it up a fair bit. Then I can adjust my shadows. That really pulls out some depth. And note that when we throw our highlights and whites to one side and our shadows and blacks to another side, we get contrast naturally. You should also be aware of this, because if you have your contrast set super high and then add in more contrast with your highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks, you can unintentionally create that Sharpie effect that I was talking about. Same with, I'm going to actually bring my whites down slightly on this. Same with if we bring our whites up too high, if we bring our blacks up too high, we get this kind of foggy, hazy effect over our entire piece. If I bring it too low, I get this contrasting, and you can really start to see what I was talking about there, about the edges and shadows really kind of popping. So I'm going to leave the blacks pretty close to the middle. The only other setting we can adjust, and I don't recommend being very liberal with this setting, is our saturation. Because our saturation, if we blow it out too much, has the same effect as that Sharpie effect I'm talking about, but with color. And if our white balance isn't perfect, like ours is not perfect, it's still a tad yellow, all the yellow is really accentuated here. That said, if you want to go for a black and white or a sepia kind of thing, this is a really good way to quickly do that. I'm going to leave our setting pretty close to the middle. And there we go. So this is our finished product. That's our beginning point. Ultimately, yes, we played with the exposure, but what this footage really needed was a quick bit of white balance. So the only other thing to keep in mind is that, bear with me for 1 second. If we shot a bunch of shots in the same location, under the same lighting, same similar effects, very often our shots will all need very similar color correction. And rather than go through and adjust all the settings by hand every time, what we can do is we can import a base layer by right-clicking on a clip we have adjusted, clicking copy, then going over our next clip, right-clicking and clicking paste attributes. The key here is to make sure that you don't accidentally drag over any other settings. If your one shot was zoomed in slightly, don't drag over motion, don't drag over opacity. You just want to make sure that the effects checkbox is selected and that you have lumetri color selected. And when I hit OK, the shot's automatically changed. It's still a bit dark. Our shot's not exactly the same, and so the settings are going to be different, but our white balance was fixed immediately. So now I just make a couple odd other adjustments. I'll bring up my exposure a tad. I'll bring my contrast down a little bit. And then throw... let's adjust. There we go. So I'm brightening everything up and then bringing the blacks down to create some more contrast. And this versus that is a world of difference. And it took half the time because we already imported in a setting that we created before. The only other thing I'll adjust, I'll bring up the saturation a little bit to make these candies pop. So when we play through, our entire shot is nice and clean and not gross and yellow like this one. So that's pretty much all I have to show you. There's plenty more for color correction to go over, but I wanted to just go over the basic correction settings so that you can get started on your kind of journey playing around with color correction. In the future, I will have more tutorials on different things we can do with this and different ways we can color correct footage. But for now, play around with the basics, play around with the other settings and see what you can come up with. Play around with curves and learn them. I'll probably do another tutorial on curves specifically. But with that, I'm going to sign off. So I'm Christopher Arndt, and thank you for watching. You can catch me not only on this YouTube channel with my tutorials, but you can catch me on Twitch at the channel Chris_Arndt_instructor. I have regular classes on there, at least currently. So have a good one, guys.